On a cold Missouri night in 1897, the lamps of a farmhouse on a lonely ridge burned long after midnight. Neighbors whispered of strange sounds drifting across the valley, voices hushed, urgent, and sometimes broken by weeping. Inside that weather-beaten house lived a father and his sons, shut away from the world. What began as grief over a buried wife hardened into something darker, something no one in town dared name aloud. For years, the shutters stayed closed, the pew in church sat empty, and the boys of that house grew pale as ghosts, walking only by lamplight. When children began to appear, frail and malformed, rumors spread that blood too close had been joined. Officials called them the most inbred sons the county had ever seen. But how does a family collapse into such silence? And why did an entire community turn away as the horror grew inside those walls? If you're drawn into stories that history tried to bury, you're in the right place. Go ahead and tap the like button, subscribe, and share this with a friend who enjoys uncovering the hidden chapters of the past. It helps more than you know, and it keeps us exploring these haunting tales together. In the winter of 1897, a lonely ridge in southern Missouri bore witness to silence deeper than the snow. A man named Elias stood there, burying his grief and retreating into isolation. The farmhouse he kept with his sons loomed over barren fields. Once alive with the sounds of family, it now echoed only with footsteps and whispers carried through drafty corridors where light seldom reached. Neighbors recalled shutters nailed tight, voices hushed within, and the pew where Elias once sat now empty each Sunday. His sons vanished from school, absent from the ledgers that recorded every boy's attendance. Elias told townsmen he would teach them himself, yet no books were ever borrowed, no lessons recorded, and no boy reappeared on the paths others walked to school. Silence grew heavier than winter snow. The ridge itself sealed their solitude. Roads turned impassable after storms, isolating the farmhouse for weeks. When Elias came to town, he came alone, sons hidden, figures glimpsed only by lantern light at night. Local men whispered of pale faces behind glass, eyes too wide for daylight. Without a father's presence, every decision rested on Elias's word, and his sternness became law within those boarded walls. Elias carried himself with a silence that unsettled taverns and trading posts. He answered inquiries about his boys with only, "They're well enough," quickly changing the subject before any man pressed further. The first suspicions were not shouted but scribbled. A storekeeper's diary noted Elias's unwillingness to discuss his family. "The man avoids inquiry," he wrote. "When asked of his sons, he ends conversation." Soon, whispers began to root in the valley. Farmers passing the ridge claimed they heard muffled cries in the night. Not joyous, not mournful. Something stranger, something sharp, often swallowed quickly by silence. By the turn of the century, the sons' names disappeared entirely from public records. No baptisms, no confirmations, no marriages. Their absence was glaring in a community where every boy left some trace. A preacher noted with concern, Elias no longer permitted his sons to partake in worship. His remarks were filed away, forgotten by officials who believed grief could justify peculiarities too strange to explain otherwise. The community soon noticed irregularities. Neighbors reported Elias turning away physicians, muttering that matters had already been tended. Men carrying ledgers scribbled vague notes about infants delivered, weak, then vanishing swiftly from all sight. The first physical trace came in 1905 when hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The coroner described a malformed infant of unknown parentage. Locals whispered where it came from, though no man spoke openly. By 1906, tales hardened into suspicion. Men spoke of candlelight flickering all night, of Elias carrying bundles into the woods, of faint cries drifting across valleys quickly stifled. The ridge grew feared and avoided. Ledger entries used chilling euphemisms. Irregular lineage, defective stock. Weak-minded, Though names were absent, the pattern pointed toward Elias's household. Doctors wrote cautiously, unwilling to accuse, yet every word circled the truth silently known. A poorhouse admitted infants with twisted limbs and fragile breath. Records marked them as abandoned, but everyone recognized the ridge as their origin. Consanguineous parentage, one physician scrawled, unwilling to put the father's name. Still, no sheriff acted. Law demanded testimony, confession, or undeniable proof. None came. The sons remained silent, their voices bound by their father's will. Silence became the shield Elias wielded better than any weapon. Hunters told of stumbling upon small graves near creeks. Twice, one claimed, Elias drove him off with a rifle before he could look closer. The earth itself seemed to swallow the evidence of lives. The community called them the cursed brood, whispering of children already broken at birth. Yet gossip never turned into law. Respect for privacy, pride, and fear of shame ensured no one intervened. The Ridge household turned into a legend, whispered around firelight. Fathers warned sons never to wander too near. "That place breeds silence," they said, "and silence there hides what no man dares name." In 1907, a Springfield doctor recorded a patient from the hills, delivered by night. A frail infant, lifeless within days. He wrote reluctantly, "Father present, no husband, consanguineous." His pen trailed faintly, ashamed to continue. Other physicians recorded similar encounters. Each time, Elias arranged visits. Each time, sons stood voiceless. Clinical notes spoke of hydrocephalus, spinal curvature, malformed limbs. Behind each phrase was the same unseen household on the ridge. Poorhouse ledgers filled with infants of defective constitution. 2 died before their first birthdays. Another boy, unnamed, survived 4 years before succumbing to incurable weakness. Every entry bore the same unspoken origin. The county's silence deepened. A traveling preacher lodged at the farmhouse in 1911. His affidavit later described pale sons, children faint of breath, and Elias commanding with low voice. He left shaken, disturbed profoundly. He filed a statement with the sheriff, accusing Elias of unnatural relations within his household. For the first time, allegations entered official record. Yet without testimony, the sheriff concluded, "Case cannot stand, no charges." The preacher departed the county, unwilling to remain where silence outweighed truth. The sheriff filed the matter as unproven. Newspapers printed vague lines. "Unwholesome practices suspected in Ridge household." No names were spoken aloud. Once again, silence reclaimed the Ridge. The law turned its gaze elsewhere, leaving Elias untouched. And behind shuttered windows, more children appeared, frail and broken, bearing the burden of lineage twisted inward. In 1913, poorhouse records listed a boy blind from birth, his frame fragile, his condition hopeless. The following year, another infant described as malformed survived only weeks. Both traced quietly back to Elias's Ridge. Medical notes confirmed the pattern. Consanguineous stock, defects extensive, survival unlikely. Doctors wrote sparingly, unwilling to confront the truth directly, but the fragments aligned. Every document whispered what no courtroom ever dared declare. By the 1920 census, Elias remained listed as head of household, his son still under his roof, unmarried, unnamed. No grandchildren recorded. Official silence stood against unofficial truth spoken only in hushed corners. Hunters claimed to see Elias carrying bundles into the forest at night. Graves, small and unmarked, appeared near creeks. Travelers avoided the Ridge Road, uneasy at the rumors that clung like mist. By the 1930s, the farmhouse collapsed into ruin. Elias long dead, Sons vanished from ledgers, unmarked graves swallowed by weeds. Yet archivists unearthed sheriff's logs and doctors' notes, piecing fragments into a chilling whole. A burned affidavit revealed the preacher's words: unnatural relation, no testimony. Poorhouse ledgers repeated phrases: defective stock, weak-minded, unwholesome parentage. Each scrap of evidence was a shard, together forming a mirror of horror. Oral histories carried whispers. Old men recalled pale boys at windows, fragile children seen briefly before vanishing. Hunters remembered unmarked mounds of earth. These memories, combined with records, forged a tale impossible to ignore. The story that emerged was not sudden violence, but gradual decay. A household turned inward, sons confined under their father's will, producing generation after generation of children broken before they could breathe freely. Elias's stern silence had become his weapon. His son's silence became his shield. Together they preserved a secrecy that allowed tragedy to fester, unchecked by law, untouched by community, protected by fear. Historians later named the children the most inbred ever recorded in those hills. Stark words, yet they cannot convey the lived suffering. Lives marked by frailty, by early graves, by records that spoke too softly. The ridge today stands empty. Weeds reclaim fields once plowed, the house collapsed into dust. Yet ledgers, diaries, and brittle papers remain, each line of ink refusing to let the story vanish. The tale endures not as rumor, but as record. Not a sensational outburst, but the slow suffocation of lives confined, of children bearing evidence in fragile bodies, of truth buried until archives unearthed it. In the end, the house on the ridge became more than ruin. It became a symbol of silence, of how grief hardens into secrecy, and how a community's refusal to speak allows horror to thrive. By the early 1900s, whispers surrounding the Ridge Farm spread beyond the valley. Men in taverns spoke carefully, never too loudly, fearing the weight of silence that guarded Elias and his sons. Every community breeds rumor, yet these murmurs carried a darker edge. They weren't idle tales, but warnings. Hunters, traders, and farmers each carried stories of strange cries heard from the ridge at night. The sons, once ordinary boys, now appeared ghostly whenever glimpsed. Witnesses described them as pale, moving in step as though bound together. Their eyes seemed accustomed only to lamplight, not the sun. What unsettled locals most wasn't their frailty, but their absence from ordinary life. No schools recorded them, no apprenticeships listed them, no man remembered trading with them in town or sharing conversation. The town ledger kept meticulous notes on every family, yet the Ridge household vanished from its pages. It was as though Elias had pulled his sons out of the living world entirely. Even in church, absence became its own presence. Empty pews reminded the congregation weekly that Elias no longer brought his boys. Silence replaced sermons regarding them, for no one dared press too far. In 1903, an entry in a physician's account book mentioned an infant of fragile constitution, delivered under secrecy, unnamed, origin unknown. Townsfolk connected it immediately with Elias's farm, though nothing official ever followed. Hunters swore they saw Elias digging at night, lantern in hand, earth piled hurriedly. When they approached, he drove them away, rifle raised, his voice cold. The shadows concealed whatever truth lay beneath. More disturbing were accounts from travelers along the Ridge Road. They heard cries carried on the wind, sometimes infants, sometimes indistinct voices calling out, then silenced abruptly as though swallowed by heavy boards. By 1905, tavern talk centered on the cursed ridge. Men said any boy born there was doomed from the start, carrying bloodlines twisted too close, lives stamped fragile before breath even fully arrived. Ledger entries began adopting coded language. Irregular constitution. Defects apparent at birth. Weak stock. Though never naming the family directly, every man in town knew the ridge was being recorded under other words. The fear lay not only in Elias's household, but in what silence revealed about the community. Men wondered how long suspicion could fester without action, and whether silence made them accomplices to decay. A sheriff's deputy once noted the problem in his journal. No charge without testimony, no testimony without witness. Sons say nothing. No law can touch them. Silence thicker than walls. His entry ended abruptly. Though whispers grew, men seldom confronted Elias directly. He carried himself with a cold presence, eyes unflinching, words clipped. Even in public, silence followed him like a cloak no man dared pierce. The sons remained hidden, yet their rare appearances unnerved observers. One traveler described them walking in lockstep, shoulders stooped, faces strikingly similar. He later wrote, "They seemed not brothers, but mirror images." In 1906, another shallow grave was discovered by the creek. Bones small, features irregular. The coroner listed unknown parentage. The community whispered the truth, yet once more the law recorded nothing beyond anonymity. More troubling still were rumors of Elias carrying newborns to town physicians under cover of night, always alone, always claiming guardianship without explanation. He controlled every interaction, leaving no space for questions. Doctors' notes read like riddles. Congenital malformation, parentage uncertain. Stock defective. Survival unlikely. Each phrase was restraint disguised as record, truth hinted but never declared. The valley's whispers filled the gaps left unsaid. The community began treating the ridge as haunted. Wagons avoided the path, hunters refused to camp nearby, and even children dared not speak the family's name for fear it might summon misfortune. Yet secrecy itself carried a lure. Men whispered in taverns about the house as though recounting a ghost story. Each retelling added unease, each detail passing like an ember kept alive in darkness. By 1907, medical records hinted at patterns too precise to ignore. Infants described in almost identical terms, weak, misshapen, frail of breath. Though anonymous on paper, everyone knew the ridge supplied these tragic entries. Officials carried records cautiously, filing them in margins rather than headlines. Their silence protected Elias more effectively than violence could. In truth, bureaucracy itself became part of the ridge's wall of secrecy. One county clerk scribbled a telling note in a margin. Origin suspected. Ridge. His pencil mark later burned in a courthouse fire, yet whispers ensured memory outlived the fragile ink of records. The Ridge household's secrecy bred fear. Men asked themselves if confronting Elias would risk bloodshed, for he was often seen armed, wary, and unwilling to let any man cross his threshold uninvited. Those who glimpsed the sons said their gazes carried desperation. Eyes wide, lips pressed tight, movements mechanical. Witnesses later swore the boys seemed bound not only by walls but by fear itself. The valley, though outwardly silent, grew restless inside. Men wondered how long fate could be ignored, whether truth would one day burst from that house, undeniable and grotesque, forcing reckoning upon them all. Every whispered story sharpened unease. The pale sons glimpsed at a window, the muffled cries drifting into fields, the quick silencing of voices. Each detail added a brick to the growing wall of legend. By 1908, even officials in nearby counties recorded suspected consanguinity when admitting infants. The words clinical and restrained were unambiguous in implication. The ridge was being acknowledged indirectly, though never openly condemned. Still, no witness spoke aloud. Without testimony, Elias remained untouchable. His sons, silent as stone, endured whatever fate bound them. Their stillness protected their father as effectively as locked doors or rifles could. The legend thickened with each passing year. Strangers traveling through the valley often heard only fragments, yet those fragments were enough to leave them uneasy, convinced something unnatural thrived unseen in the hills. The ridge thus became not only a place of secrecy, but a mirror for the community's failings. Their unwillingness to speak became part of the horror, binding them to Elias's silence forever. Occasional entries in medical books became the valley's only official testimony. Each clinical phrase, detached and cold, carried the weight of hidden cries and graves never marked. Truth existed, but only in fragments. Hunters once recounted hearing a man's low voice scolding sharply, followed by the faint cries of an infant. They dared not approach. Even armed, they felt powerless against the darkness of that house. By 1910, the whispers had hardened into accepted fact. Men no longer asked whether the ridge hid horror. They spoke instead of how much, how many, how long it had been endured. The ridge became a story fathers told sons, a lesson wrapped in unease. Stay clear of that house. Some silence is too heavy, some secrets too dark, some truths better left unseen. Yet truth, however buried, leaves traces. Shallow graves, coded ledgers, doctors' euphemisms, each fragment served as a ghostly reminder that silence could not erase evidence forever. The valley's whispers kept the story alive. Elias, however, lived undisturbed. He walked into town when needed, his silence unbroken, his sons hidden. Each trip confirmed his defiance, daring the community to act while knowing they never would. The sons grew into shadows, unseen except in fleeting glimpses. Men who caught sight of them swore they carried resemblance too close, features nearly identical, as if nature itself bore witness to secrecy. By the end of the decade, the whispers were no longer uncertain, but resigned. The valley accepted the ridge as cursed, a scar on its landscape, and bore its silence like inherited burden. The story of the ridge spread outward slowly, creeping into records, rumors, and recollections. What had begun as whispers was hardening into history, each fragment a step toward a truth no one could deny. By 1911, the valley's whispers no longer lived only in taverns or kitchens. They began appearing in ledgers, affidavits, and casebooks. The ridge was no longer rumor alone, but documented suspicion. A traveling preacher, lodged at Elias's farmhouse, later described pale sons moving like shadows, children faint of breath, and a father commanding with iron voice. His testimony unsettled officials, yet collapsed for lack of proof. The sheriff entered the preacher's words carefully into his book. Unwholesome practices suspected, no testimony given. Without confession or direct witness, law could not advance. Silence shielded Elias once again. The preacher's affidavit carried weight, yet Elias's sons spoke nothing. Their eyes lowered, their mouths closed. Their silence became his armor, and without their testimony, suspicion dissolved back into frustrated whispers. Newspapers covered the matter cautiously. Allegations investigated. No action taken. No names printed, no farm mentioned. Yet every man in the county knew which ridge house those muted lines described. Once again, the shutters closed. The Ridge household returned to secrecy, unbroken by inquiry. Community men sighed relief, unwilling to push further. Behind boards and darkness, Elias resumed his rule unchecked. But silence cannot bury truth forever. County poorhouses continued admitting infants described as malformed, frail, or blind. Records listed them as abandoned, though every whisper pointed to Elias as the source. In 1913, one entry read, "Boy admitted, blind from birth, frame weak, suspected consanguinity." Spare words on a page spoke volumes. The valley recognized the ridge, even if the law refused. A year later, another entry described, Male child, irregular lineage, deceased after 2 months. Cold phrases in brittle ink carried more certainty than gossip, marking tragedy that officials dared not fully name. Doctors continued writing cautiously. Congenital defect, parentage uncertain, survival unlikely. They never recorded Elias's name, but the rhythm of cases, the secrecy of arrivals, all pointed toward that single household on the ridge. The fragments built a grim mosaic. Each frail child became part of a pattern, each shallow grave a testimony. Even without direct accusation, the evidence grew impossible to dismiss entirely. Hunters added their accounts, describing Elias digging by lantern light near the creek. When approached, he leveled his rifle, warning them away. The earth seemed to swallow evidence of short, tragic lives. Travelers told of faint cries drifting across valleys, hushed suddenly by forceful commands. Some claimed they saw boys pacing behind shutters, faces too alike, movements mechanical, shadows of what sons should have been. The ridge soon became more than secrecy. It became dread itself. No man wished to approach. The household's silence poisoned the land, turning it into a place avoided even in daylight. By 1915, Springfield physicians noted similar cases: hydrocephalus, malformation, consanguineous, each note clinical, detached, yet chilling in its restraint. Every case aligned perfectly with the times Elias was seen traveling under cover of night. Poorhouse ledgers echoed the doctors. Weak constitution, deceased shortly after admission. Defective stock, unclaimed. Each entry bore the weight of lives erased almost as quickly as they appeared, never named, never remembered. The preacher's affidavit lingered in courthouse files until a fire destroyed records in 1916. Only fragments survived. Unnatural relation. No testimony. The words, half burned, still carried the chill of truth. Without full documents, officials shrugged the case into oblivion. The law demanded confession, but Elias's sons remained silent. Their silence became unbreakable walls, stronger than wood or stone, protecting their father's dominion. Community men recognized their failure. By refusing to speak openly, they allowed secrecy to deepen. Fear, pride, and reluctance to confront made them participants, bound by silence just as surely as Elias's sons. More infants entered poorhouses during the late 1910s, some blind, some twisted, others failing within days. Officials described them politely as unclaimed. In reality, everyone knew their blood carried the ridge's unmistakable mark. Old hunters recalled graves hidden near the woods. Some claimed to have seen Elias lowering small bundles, earth piled in haste. His rifle, ever present, kept witnesses distant, truth buried beyond reach. By 1920, census records still listed Elias as head of household with sons beneath his roof. No mention of children appeared. Official silence again denied what every ledger and whisper already knew. The ridge became legend, a place of warnings told from father to son. "Stay away," men muttered. Some silence hides more than sorrow. Some silence hides what cannot be endured. Archivists later uncovered medical fragments confirming the whispers. Irregular parentage. Consanguineous defect. Incurable condition. Each phrase spoke of children whose bodies bore witness to lineage twisted inward, testimonies written not in voices, but in frailty. Travelers described the sight of boys at windows, staring with hollow expressions. They seemed not merely siblings but reflections, features too close, expressions too identical, as though nature itself testified against secrecy. The ridge was no longer seen as private grief, but as a scar across the valley. Every man who avoided it acknowledged in silence the weight of what lay hidden there. By the early 1920s, stories hardened into history. The valley no longer asked whether Elias's household was cursed. They asked instead how many lives had been lost, how long the silence would last. Still, the household endured. Elias continued trading livestock in town, eyes steady, words clipped. His silence mocked the community's reluctance, daring them to act while knowing they never would. The sons aged in shadows, rarely seen, their presence marked only by rumor. No apprenticeships, no marriages, no ordinary milestones. They existed only as pale shapes drifting behind shuttered glass. The poorhouses continued receiving children. Records described them with the same restrained language. Lives extinguished quickly, buried anonymously. Behind each line lay evidence of the ridge, unspoken but undeniable to those who read closely. Some men admitted later they feared confronting Elias more than they feared ghosts. His silence, his weapon, his rifle, all combined to keep neighbors distant, even when unease gnawed at every thought. The ridge's children, though brief in life, spoke louder than witnesses ever could. Their twisted forms, their fragile bodies, became testimonies etched into ledgers, haunting reminders of what silence had permitted. Community pride transformed into guilt. Men realized their refusal to confront Elias made them complicit in shadows. Their silence did not protect decency, it protected secrecy, allowing suffering to multiply unseen. By the late 1920s, the Ridge House was seen less as home, more as prison. Its boarded windows seemed not to shield from outsiders, but to cage lives shaped by one man's command. Rumors of graves persisted, always denied, never investigated. Yet stories of Elias digging under starlight endured, told by hunters and travelers alike. Each retelling strengthened the valley's certainty of hidden tragedy. The silence itself became legendary. Fathers warned sons, "What you refuse to confront grows stronger." The ridge stood as proof of those words, a monument to the price of avoidance. When archivists pieced together records decades later, they found a trail of fragments, burned affidavits, coded medical notes, poorhouse ledgers, all pointed to one conclusion. The ridge produced children broken by lineage too close. These children of silence left no voices, no names, no testimonies. Yet their very existence, however brief, forced the truth to endure. They became history's evidence, carried not in words but in bones. By the 1930s, Elias was gone. His sons faded from records. The house collapsed, weeds reclaiming the land. Yet the fragments remained, preserving the story in ledgers, diaries, and haunted recollections. The children of silence, erased from ordinary life, could not be erased from memory. Each ledger, each rumor, each grave became a reminder. The ridge endured, not in walls, but in history. By the 1930s, the Ridge House had collapsed into ruin. Elias was long gone, his sons unrecorded in parish or census, their graves, if they existed, lost beneath weeds and brush. Yet the story refused to vanish. Archivists, historians, and local clerks began uncovering fragments buried in courthouse boxes, poorhouse ledgers, and diaries. Together, they revealed a tale too haunting to remain forgotten. One clerk, cataloging damaged papers, discovered a sheriff's note half-burned by fire. Only a few words survived. Unnatural relation, no testimony. Even incomplete, the phrase carried the weight of unspeakable truth. At Drury College, a graduate student combing through ledgers noticed repeated entries describing boys of defective constitution admitted from the ridge. He traced the records backward, all pointing unerringly to Elias's household. Letters surfaced from a traveling preacher who once lodged at the farm. He described sons bound by secrecy, children broken at birth, and a father claiming divine right to command their fate. Though couched in biblical tones, the meaning was clear. The preacher had seen with his own eyes what others only whispered. His words, preserved in brittle pages, became part of the permanent record. Oral historians added voices decades later. Old men remembered pale boys at windows, fragile infants glimpsed briefly before vanishing, graves hidden in the woods. Memories became evidence when paired with official scraps of paper. Together, fragments formed a chilling whole. The ridge was no longer rumor, no longer folklore. It became documented history, a record of secrecy breeding suffering, of silence preserving tragedy across generations. The tale carried power not through violence, but through slow decay. Lives lived behind shutters, sons bound to one man's will, producing children whose bodies bore scars of lineage turned inward. Archivists pieced it carefully, affidavits half-burned, ledgers coded with euphemisms, diaries describing muffled cries, each fragment small alone, but together, undeniable. The ridge became a symbol of truth hidden until records spoke. The story endured not because men wanted it remembered, but because paper refused to forget. Fragile ink outlasted silence, forcing later generations to face what neighbors once chose to ignore. By mid-century, the ridge name resurfaced in local history circles. Scholars spoke cautiously of the cursed brood, acknowledging children whose existence confirmed what law never prosecuted. Shadows became history, undeniable and permanent. Hunters interviewed in old age recalled nights hearing cries silenced abruptly. They remembered Elias carrying bundles into the forest, lantern light flickering before graves disappeared beneath hastily packed earth. Memories aligned with records. For decades, the community had borne silence as shield, yet silence transformed into guilt. Each rediscovered ledger, each diary, reminded descendants of the valley's failure to confront the horrors in their midst. The Ridge household became cautionary legend. Fathers told sons, "Silence protects nothing but secrecy. Confront darkness before it festers." The story lived on as moral warning as much as historical memory. By the 1950s, scholars openly described the Ridge as producing the most inbred children in county history. Stark words, stripped of euphemism, finally named the suffering once hidden behind coded phrases. The land itself became eerie monument. Weeds overtook fields, timbers collapsed, yet locals swore the ridge carried presence. Men claimed the silence there felt heavier than elsewhere, as though history lingered tangibly. Census takers left no trace of the son's later years. Their names faded, their bodies unmarked, their lives measured only by the children born frail, brief, and consigned to anonymity. The Ridge story, however, did not fade. Newspapers began revisiting it, historians debated it, and archivists cataloged it. Each new discovery etched the tale deeper into collective memory, erasing any hope of forgetting. What emerged was not sensational horror, but suffocating tragedy. Elias's silence bound his sons, secrecy preserved decay, and the community's reluctance allowed suffering to grow unchecked. Shadows thrived because no man dared speak. Records revealed a simple truth. Grief had hardened into secrecy, secrecy into silence, silence into horror. Each stage left evidence, ledger lines, diary fragments, shallow graves that testified to the price of avoidance. Even in ruin, the Ridge retained symbolic weight. It stood as testament to what happens when silence triumphs over truth, when a community chooses to look away rather than confront. The story became more than history of one farm. It became parable of how darkness thrives unchallenged. The Ridge symbolized silence itself, the destructive power of secrecy, the burden of complicity. Archivists called it a tragedy measured in ledgers. Scholars named it the slowest crime. Locals whispered it was the curse of the Ridge. Each description pointed to the same unshakable reality. The son's silence had shielded Elias, but their silence also doomed them. Their stillness became legacy, binding their lives to history's darkest margins, remembered only as shadows of what should have been. Graves remained unmarked. Names faded entirely. Yet history recorded them through their absence, through the physical evidence of children born broken, through scraps of testimony left smoldering in courthouse fires. By the 1970s, researchers compiled the fragments into coherent narrative. What neighbors whispered became historical fact. The Ridge household was no longer legend but documented case, preserved across generations in reluctant ink. The valley's silence echoed long after. Men admitted guilt in interviews, confessing that avoidance had enabled suffering. "We knew," one elderly farmer said simply. "We knew and said nothing. That was our crime." Such admissions carried weight, revealing that silence had not only scarred the Ridge but the entire community. The burden of complicity passed through generations, a shame inherited alongside memory. The Ridge thus became cautionary ground, not sacred, not cursed, but instructive. Its story taught how secrecy corrodes, how silence multiplies suffering, and how truth eventually surfaces, however late, however heavy. By the century's close, the Ridge remained empty, but the documents ensured its story could never vanish. Affidavits, ledgers, diaries, recollections, all pieced together into a chilling testimony of silence unbroken. The legacy endured not in Elias's name, nor in his sons, but in the lesson they left. Silence does not erase truth. Truth waits, patient, surfacing through ink, ash, and brittle paper. The Ridge household, forgotten in life, became eternal in history. Its silence could not smother memory. Its secrecy could not prevent discovery. Shadows endured, not as rumor, but as record. The most haunting truth was not the broken children, nor the ruined farm, but the silence itself. Silence had been both shield and weapon, both prison and inheritance, the darkest legacy of all.